Welcome to today's edition of the Practitioner's Problem of Practice, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. Today we have a guest with us, and I'm going to go ahead and have her introduce herself.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Sherie Cunningham. I am a 7th grade reading and language arts teacher, and I'm also the department chair of the language arts department. I have been teaching for 12 years. And I started off my career in a very urban school district, and currently I teach at a very suburban school district. And I'm very happy to be here and very excited to discuss problem of practice with my colleagues.
And we're so grateful to have you here to share with us. So in each episode, we discuss a practitioner-based challenge, and we try to think about it through a human-centered lens. And these conversations are supposed to be grounded in the practical work that happens in our schools, and they help us to bring our compass points into focus around these topics or challenges or issues. So, Sherie, go ahead and share the thing that you'd like to discuss.
Well, I think it's only appropriate to discuss standardized testing. The PSSAs do start tomorrow, and I don't know about your experience with them, but my whole year is pretty much hyped up to this pressure-filled window of 3 days, 2 hours a day, 6 hours. So really that, I'm not sure if it's a problem of practice that I want to discuss. It's more of a question, like what exactly is the utility of these tests in our modern education system? In my personal and professional opinion, they don't seem to serve much of a purpose to me. And I can definitely assure you they don't also serve much of a purpose for my students. So I'm just wondering if maybe somewhere farther up the ladder, do they serve some sort of valuable purpose? What do these tests bring to the table? And why should we keep them around in our post-COVID world?
So for those of you who aren't from Pennsylvania, the PSSAs are our state assessment that we measure students learning against the standards in math and RELA in grades 3 through 8. And then science in grades 4 and 8. So for those of you in other states, you have your own round of standardized tests. But one thing I would add to the conversation before we kind of broaden it up is Sherie asked the question about, what value does it bring above? There are certainly those who would say that, having a good sense of the data helps us to determine whether our curriculum is in alignment to the standards, whether our students are being successful to the standards. And so I think a thing that I'm kind of alluding to here is part of our work here at the Human School is really around not being so standard. The idea that the standardization covenant that Todd Rose talks about is one that tries to keep everybody in line and compliant and doesn't really speak to the individual. So that's the one thing I will add to get the conversation started, and just anybody jump in here. What do we think the value is for teachers or kids or for us, and what might we replace them with?
I just love, Chad, how you put so much emphasis on that word standard, those standards. There's so many standards. And I know you're trying.
The facial expression, too.
And Chad, I know you're trying to be like really even about it, but it's not coming off even at all.
That's all right. I wasn't trying to be. I was definitely like trying to needle there. Sherie, this idea of everyone doing the same thing in the same way all the time is really at the heart of what that is. And so the standardized tests are a way to measure how similar everyone is in their understanding of these. I don't want to say they're unimportant, because I think there are parts of the tests from a skill-based perspective that we want kids to have. I don't want to be the person who's like, no, we shouldn't be teaching students, some of these core standards. But I do think that the emphasis and the overemphasis on them as being the only thing that matters in schools. You started this conversation saying all this work is built up for these 3 days. And that feels to me, unfortunately, like a really nasty byproduct of the testing.
I think Sherie,
I don't want to say oh, sorry, Randy.
No, I just was going to say, I think you were going to add something. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's not that I don't have anything against the standards. In fact, I think the standards are well written. I think they're wonderful, and I think about them every single minute of every single day, pretty much every time I do anything. So it's not that I'm against the standards. Like I feel like they're very important in like planning and reflection. It's just that, do we really need to be such slaves to them? Like, I think it's great to use them as a guide, But then like the tests kind of seem to reinforce this unhealthy obsession we have to reach that standard and exceed that standard. And I just don't think that's very realistic or very healthy for the students that we have.
I think we could look at this problem of practice question through a lot of the different compass points or mind shifts. And the one that I'm drawn to originally, when you originally stated the problem, was the idea that focused on the future. So the question I have is, how do standardized tests actually help us focus on the future and not on helping kids perform better in the future on standardized tests, but actually like looking outside of school at the larger context of the world? And are we, with our standards and our curriculum and the work that students and teachers do in the classroom, are we actually preparing our kids to thrive in that chaotic, complex world? And I don't know. I don't know if the answer is yes. And so then why are we doing it? So the future focused mindset was the one that immediately struck me, but I think we could also look at the one around stories and numbers. Like, they're all numbers, and God forbid we try to put a story behind those numbers sometimes. So I think there's a real mismatch there as well.
I'm thinking too about your question about, does it serve a higher purpose, and not, I don't mean that in like a higher purpose, but I think about the sort of like school panic that happened 40 years ago, the studies that were done that showed the education system was failing, and that there was inequity and but the development in some ways of those tests and the standards was to try to create that standardization, that every school has this barometer that they're supposed to hit, and that if schools want to be able to be compared or are compared by colleges or the state to determine who's successful, here is the way that we do it, right? We create these standards. We say you have to meet them or exceed them, and then we're going to give you a test to figure that out. And then if you don't, we're going to punish you, or, we've gone through those iterations of consequences. As a result of that, I think about Randy's point around the future and about trying to be curious, as part of our compass points. I have a hard time believing that people look at the state standardized test scores and think this is preparing kids for the future. It feels like it's not about the future. It feels like it's about evaluating how the year went, then using that to evaluate teachers, and then just sort of like with a hope and a prayer that as a result of those results, that people will change their teaching practices or schools will become more rigorous for the next group. Like, it's not about the future, the test itself, the feedback itself. It's about looking at the past, telling you how you did, and then hoping that you'll do something about it differently than you did before if you weren't successful. So that's kind of where my head is, because I'm not sure that I see how they're about the future intentionally, but maybe more as like a byproduct. I don't know. So
if I could bring us into the last lap of our conversation here with sort of a thought experiment. I know Chad has oftentimes said, too, that we haven't done a good job of proposing any alternatives. So we can say we don't like them, but what actually have we as educators collectively proposed as an alternative? So what would we propose as an alternative to those wonderful PSSAs and keystones that are starting tomorrow and going to last probably up until the last week of school, I'm sure? What would the alternative be? What might it look like? Even if we don't have an answer, what might some aspect of it look like?
Well, I mean, I definitely think that schools who work towards competency-based, so to Sherie's point, it's probably not the standards inherently themselves, it's the application or the misapplication of the standards. I mean, and Sherie eloquently stated something I oftentimes say, which is, standards are a guidepost. They're not a hitching post. They help to guide our thinking, but they're this thing that we can't be beholden to. I guess where I struggle is not so much about how we rethink the standards. It's what are all the other things that schools have opportunities for kids to show their learning in that don't get measured or the stories aren't told around those. So what happens is the standardized tests become the amplified thing because what we haven't done is told the story of those other things. So all those things that are maybe less easy to measure, creativity, collaboration, and not to go back to the 20th century 4Cs, but those things that we value, that they get drowned out, and we don't do a great job of making that a part of our story. And so I think that a school or a district or a community, through something like a profile of a learner, could articulate what those things are that they value and then drive towards those things. Standardized tests are part of our world. We can't avoid them, but they become so focused because we don't tell the story of those other things that are happening around us. That'd be my
just
shot.
to build off of that too, Chad, I'm going to completely agree with you. I think that it's not necessarily the test that needs to change. It's not the standards that needs to change. It's our attitudes toward them. We have to stop being so worshiping of the test scores. We ourselves and our collective community, we are the ones that need to stop placing such a cut your throat to get a test score emphasis on them, because it's just not healthy. The test itself, okay, it's not the greatest test I've ever seen, but I think it's that we put so much pressure on ourselves, we put so much pressure on our students. And I think that's the portion of it that needs to change. And I can only hope moving forward. I know in my own practice, 5 years ago, I used to be very concerned. I would say, hey, we need to start preparing. But this year, I'm just I don't really care. Do your best. I always want you to do your best, but I am not going through 3 months of test practice preparation. I just want you guys to feel good and do well and just do the top part of your performance. And I always want that. So I think that's one small step that I can make to make that shift in our mindset, in our collective mindset.
All right. I think we're sort of rounding the bend here. Do we want to wrap it up?
Well, I'm wondering, Randy, if you have any thoughts around that, or Rachel, around what you would do.
I like your idea about telling the story, and when you were putting that point forth, the question came to mind. Well, why don't we do that? Well, because we're so bathed in the idea of compliance, which goes to the leadership mindset too. So I think it's stepping up and being more intentional about telling those stories. And I do agree that we're probably fighting a bad fight if we think that we're going to actually eliminate standardized test scores. So how do we live with them, and how do we balance it out? That requires us to take some leadership and to tell some stories, and not only us telling stories, but what about our kids telling stories too?
Yep. I love that. All right. So we would like to thank Sherie for being with us this week and for asking a wonderful question, certainly timely one. And we would love to invite anyone in our community to come and have a similar conversation with us. You can ask it in our community Facebook group or visit thehuman.school and the Learning and Public Hub for additional resources. And again, we are committed to placing humanity at the center of all design. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.